The hero's journey is not a narrative convenience devised by screenwriters seeking emotional resonance. It is the fundamental architecture of consciousness itself, the pattern by which the psyche awakens to its own depths and transforms the raw material of existence into meaning. When Joseph Campbell synthesized the world's mythologies into his Monomyth, and when Carl Jung mapped the contours of the collective unconscious, they were not inventing theories. They were documenting a discovery as ancient as human awareness, a discovery that the Hermetic tradition had encoded in symbol and allegory for millennia before modern psychology gave it clinical language. The seeker who encounters the hero's journey today confronts a philosophical problem that has plagued humanity since the first moment of self-reflection. How does one move from the prison of unconscious existence to the liberation of authentic being? This is not merely an abstract question for academic contemplation. It is the existential crisis that defines every meaningful human life. The hero's journey, properly understood, is the map of individuation, the alchemical process by which lead consciousness transforms into gold, by which the scattered fragments of the psyche coalesce into an integrated self capable of confronting both the terror and ecstasy of existence. The lineage of this understanding stretches back through the mists of antiquity. The Corpus Hermeticum speaks of the ascent of the soul through the planetary spheres, each representing a stage of purification and realization. The Emerald Tablet of Hermes Trismegistus declares, "As above, so below," encoding the Hermetic principle that the macrocosm of universal transformation mirrors the microcosm of individual awakening. Manly Palmer Hall, in his encyclopedic works on secret teachings, demonstrated how every authentic mystery tradition, from the Egyptian rites to the Eleusinian mysteries, enacted this same fundamental drama of death and rebirth, dissolution and reintegration. Jung recognized that these ancient systems were not primitive superstitions, but sophisticated maps of psychological transformation. His concept of individuation, the process by which the ego confronts and integrates the unconscious to birth the self, parallels exactly the alchemical opus that Paracelsus and the medieval adepts pursued in their laboratories. Campbell, drawing on this psychological framework, showed that the hero's journey is the universal structure of this transformation, appearing in every culture because it describes not a cultural artifact, but the actual mechanics of consciousness evolving toward wholeness. The true secret, then, is this: the journey is not external but internal. The dragons, the labyrinths, the divine gifts, and the return with the elixir are all operations occurring within the landscape of the soul. The modern seeker who recognizes this stands at the threshold of the greatest adventure available to human consciousness. Campbell's articulation of the hero's journey identifies 12 distinct stages organized into 3 major acts: departure, initiation, and return. These are not arbitrary divisions but correspond precisely to the triadic structure that appears throughout Hermetic philosophy. The alchemists spoke of the threefold nature of matter as salt, sulfur, and mercury, representing body, soul, and spirit. The Rosicrucians organized their initiation into 3 degrees. The structure of transformation itself appears to demand this tripartite movement, a leaving behind, a transformative ordeal, and an integration that synthesizes the previous states into something transcendent. The 12 stages themselves form a complete mandala of transformation. In the departure phase, the hero experiences the call to adventure, the initial disruption that shatters complacency. This is followed by the refusal of the call, the ego's natural resistance to change and self-preservation. The appearance of supernatural aid represents the first intervention of the unconscious, offering guidance and protection. Crossing the first threshold marks the point of no return, the commitment to transformation. Finally, the belly of the whale represents the complete dissolution of the old identity, the nigredo or blackening phase of alchemy, where all previous certainties decompose. The initiation phase contains the core transformative work. The road of trials presents a series of challenges that test and strengthen the hero's emerging capacities. The meeting with the goddess represents the encounter with the anima, the feminine aspect of the psyche that offers love, acceptance, and wholeness. Woman as temptress reveals the shadow side of desire, the ways attachment and fear can derail transformation. Atonement with the Father confronts the principle of authority, judgment, and the superego, demanding reconciliation with the paternal archetype. Apotheosis marks the death of the ego and the birth of the self, the moment of enlightenment or gnosis. The ultimate boon is the treasure won through this ordeal, the philosopher's stone, the elixir of life, the wisdom that transforms existence. The return phase addresses the crucial question all mystery traditions must answer. What responsibility does the initiate bear toward the uninitiated? The refusal of the return shows the temptation to remain in transcendent states rather than returning to ordinary life. The magic flight represents the often difficult journey back to consensus reality while maintaining one's hard-won insights. Rescue from without acknowledges that even the transformed individual needs community and assistance. The crossing of the return threshold demands that the initiate find ways to translate ineffable experiences into communicable wisdom. Master of Two Worlds indicates the achievement of integration, the ability to move fluidly between ordinary and transcendent consciousness. Freedom to live represents the final state, authentic existence, freed from the compulsions of unconscious drives and fears. This system interconnects profoundly with the Kabbalistic tree of life, where the hero's descent and ascent mirror the path from Malkuth to Kether, traversing the various Sephiroth that represent different states of consciousness and being. The Neoplatonic concept of the soul's descent into matter and subsequent return to the One provides the philosophical framework that underlies both Campbell's Monomyth and the Hermetic tradition. The Rosicrucian allegory of Christian Rosenkreuz's journey to the chemical wedding contains all these stages in symbolic form, demonstrating that the Western esoteric tradition had fully articulated this process centuries before modern psychology. The mentality required of the adept who would traverse this path demands what Crowley called true will, the alignment of conscious intention with the deepest purpose of the self. It requires the ethical commitment to truth that Eliphas Levi identified as essential to all genuine magical work. Above all, it demands the willingness to doubt, to question every certainty, to dissolve every comfortable belief in the alchemical solvent of rigorous self-examination. The hero's journey is not for those seeking comfort or confirmation. It is for those willing to die to what they are in order to become what they might be. Stage 1. The call to adventure. The journey begins with disruption. The hero, dwelling in the ordinary world of routine and unconscious habit, receives a call that shatters the familiar. This may arrive as crisis, as opportunity, as a dream that will not be forgotten, or as an encounter with something that reveals the insufficiency of current existence. Jung understood this as the first stirring of the self, the deeper totality of the psyche, making itself known to the ego. The self, seeking to actualize its full potential, creates circumstances that force the ego to recognize its limitations and the existence of something greater. Psychologically, this manifests as a growing awareness that the life one has been living does not fit, that the persona or mask worn for social acceptance has become a prison. The call represents the first crack in the ego's defensive structure, the initial glimpse of the shadow, the anima or animus, the archetypes that populate the collective unconscious. In modern life, this often appears as depression, anxiety, the vague but persistent sense that something essential is missing. The Hermetic understanding recognizes this as the prima materia, beginning to announce its readiness for transformation, the lead acknowledging its potential to become gold. Stage 2. Refusal of the call. The ego, confronted with this demand for transformation, instinctively recoils. Campbell noted that many heroes initially refuse their call, and this refusal is not weakness, but the natural operation of the psyche's conservative function. The ego exists to maintain stability and survival. Change represents threat. The unknown represents danger. To accept the call means to acknowledge that one's current identity is insufficient and must be dissolved. This refusal manifests psychologically as rationalization, procrastination, the mobilization of defense mechanisms to protect the status quo. One may become busier with distractions, may seek to silence the call through substances or superficial relationships, may dismiss the stirrings of the unconscious as meaningless or pathological. The alchemists understood this stage as the initial resistance of matter to the fire, the way that substance clings to its current form before yielding to transformation. Hermetic philosophy recognizes that free will includes the freedom to refuse awakening, though such refusal leads inevitably to what Jung called neurosis, the suffering that results when the conscious and unconscious personalities are at war. Stage 3. Supernatural aid. When the hero finally accepts the call, or when circumstances make refusal impossible, aid arrives from unexpected sources. This appears in myth as the wise old man, the fairy godmother, the magical helper who provides tools, knowledge, or protection. Jung identified this figure as the archetype of the self appearing in projected form, offering the ego what it needs to undertake the journey. In Hermetic terms, this is the appearance of the inner teacher, the Ordeal or holy guardian angel that Abramelin magic seeks to contact, the deeper wisdom of the psyche making itself available to consciousness. Practically, this manifests as synchronicities, as the right book appearing at the right moment, as mentors emerging when most needed, as sudden insights that provide direction. The psychological reality is that the unconscious, once engaged, begins to cooperate with the conscious intention to transform. Resources that were always present but invisible become suddenly accessible. The adept learns the first great lesson, that the universe responds to authentic commitment, that what the Hermetics called the principle of correspondence ensures that inner changes precipitate outer manifestations. Stage 4. Crossing the first threshold. The point of no return arrives. The hero must leave the familiar world and enter the realm of the unknown. This threshold is guarded by forces that test commitment and screen out those not ready for transformation. In psychological terms, this represents the moment when one commits fully to the process of individuation, accepting that there is no return to unconscious innocence. This crossing often manifests as a concrete life change, leaving a relationship, changing careers, embarking on intensive therapy or spiritual practice. But the true threshold is internal. It is the moment when one acknowledges the reality of the unconscious and commits to engaging with it directly, regardless of what might be discovered. The Hermetic tradition marks this with initiation rituals that symbolically enact death to the old life and birth into the new. The psychological equivalent is the decision to pursue truth wherever it leads, even if it destroys every cherished belief about oneself. Stage 5. Belly of the Whale. Having crossed the threshold, the hero undergoes complete dissolution. Campbell called this the belly of the whale, referencing Jonah's descent into darkness. Alchemically, this is the nigredo, the blackening, where all previous structures decompose into prima materia. Jung described this as the encounter with the shadow in its most overwhelming form, the moment when one confronts everything that has been repressed, denied, and projected. This stage is characterized by profound disorientation, by the loss of all previous reference points. The personality structures that sustained identity begin to crack and fall away. Old defenses cease to function. Repressed material surges into consciousness with overwhelming force. This is the dark night of the soul, the descent into the underworld, the death that must precede rebirth. Psychologically, this may manifest as depression, anxiety, or what can appear to be psychological breakdown, but is actually breakthrough. The Hermetic understanding is that nothing truly new can emerge until the old has been completely dissolved. The lead must be reduced to its fundamental components before it can be reconstituted as gold. Stage 6. The Road of Trials. Emerging from the depths of dissolution, the hero enters the phase of testing and strengthening. A series of challenges appears, each designed to develop specific capacities necessary for the final transformation. These trials are not random, but precisely calibrated to address the hero's particular weaknesses and to activate latent potentials. Jung understood this as the process by which ego strength is developed, sufficient to withstand the full force of the unconscious. Each challenge successfully met integrates some previously split-off aspect of the psyche, expands consciousness, and builds the capacity for greater wholeness. The trials often follow a pattern. They begin with encounters with the shadow, move toward integration of the anima or animus, and culminate in confrontation with more numinous archetypal forces. In practical terms, this manifests as the ongoing work of analysis, meditation, or active imagination, where one repeatedly engages with unconscious contents, suffers their impact, and gradually assimilates them into a more comprehensive sense of self. Each trial reveals something new about one's limitations, projections, and potentials. The alchemical parallel is the repeated distillations and purifications that gradually refine the substance, removing impurities and concentrating essential qualities. Stage 7. Meeting with the Goddess. At the heart of the transformative journey lies the encounter with the divine feminine, represented by the goddess in her many forms. This is not merely meeting a woman or even the anima, but encountering the principle of unconditional love, acceptance and nurturance that the psyche desperately needs, but the ego often fears and distrusts. Jung saw the anima as the mediator between consciousness and the unconscious, the figure who can guide the hero deeper into the self. The meeting with the goddess represents the moment when one experiences unconditional acceptance, the realization that at the core of existence is not judgment or rejection, but love. This challenges the ego's fundamental assumption that it must earn worth through achievement and perfection. Hermetically, this encounter corresponds to the alchemical marriage, the conjunctio, where masculine and feminine principles unite. Psychologically, it represents the integration of receptivity, intuition, feeling, and relatedness, all the qualities the ego may have devalued or repressed. This meeting heals the deep wound of separation and begins the process of genuine wholeness. In practical experience, this may manifest as falling deeply in love, encountering a teacher or guide who reflects one's highest potential, or experiencing mystical states of union and bliss. Stage 8. Woman as temptress. Immediately following the ecstatic encounter with the goddess comes a darker challenge. The same feminine force that offered love now appears as temptation, as the seductive pull toward attachment, comfort, and abandonment of the quest. Campbell recognized that every force has its shadow, and the goddess who nurtures can also trap. Jung understood this as the negative anima, the aspect of the feminine that keeps one infantilized, dependent and fearful of autonomy. This stage tests whether the hero has genuinely individuated or has merely traded one form of dependence for another. The temptation is to remain in the blessed state of union rather than completing the difficult journey of return and integration. In alchemical symbolism, this is the danger of dissolution into the mercurial waters, losing all structure and definition. The adept must learn to receive the gifts of the goddess without being possessed by her, to integrate the feminine without being overwhelmed. Practically, this manifests as the challenge of maintaining one's transformative commitment when comfort, pleasure, or ease beckons. It is the test of whether one's motivation is authentic spiritual development or merely escape from pain. Stage 9. Atonement with the Father. Having integrated the feminine, the hero must now confront the masculine principle in its most absolute form, the Father as law, judgment, authority, and the demand for accountability. This is often the most difficult stage because it requires the hero to face the superego, the internalized voice of judgment and prohibition that has limited and defined acceptable behavior. Jung recognized that genuine individuation requires confronting and integrating the father archetype, which represents not just personal fathers, but the principle of logos, order, and conscious discrimination. The atonement is literally at-one-ment, becoming one with this principle not through submission, but through recognition that the father's judgment is also an aspect of the self-seeking expression. This stage demands that the hero take full responsibility for existence, acknowledging complicity in creating suffering, while also recognizing the authority to change direction. The Hermetic parallel is the encounter with the solar consciousness, the king or sulfur principle, that demands purity of intention and alignment with true will. Psychologically, this manifests as confronting guilt, shame, and the ways one has betrayed one's deepest values. The resolution comes not through rejection of the father, but through mature recognition that one is becoming the father, accepting authority over one's own existence. Stage 10. Apotheosis. Having integrated both masculine and feminine principles, having passed through death and been tested by trials, the hero reaches the moment of deification or enlightenment. This is the death of the ego as the center of consciousness and its replacement by the self. Campbell described this as the moment when the hero realizes divinity, becomes one with the source of creation. Jung called this the realization of the self, the moment when the ego recognizes its true relationship to the totality of the psyche. The ego does not disappear, but finds its proper place as the executive function serving the deeper intelligence of the self. This is the moment of gnosis, the direct experience of one's true nature beyond all concepts and limitations. Alchemically, this is the achievement of the philosopher's stone, the lapis that transforms everything it touches. It is the union of opposites, the resolution of all contradictions in a higher synthesis. Hermetically, it is the realization of the maxim, know thyself, the direct experience that the individual consciousness is not separate from universal consciousness. This stage may manifest as mystical experiences, profound insight, or a permanent shift in the locus of identity from ego to self. Stage 11. The ultimate boon. The fruit of the entire journey now manifests as a concrete gift, a treasure that the hero has won through ordeal and transformation. This boon is simultaneously personal and universal, something that benefits the individual while also serving collective humanity. Campbell identified this as the elixir, the holy grail, the fire, or any symbol of ultimate value and transformative power. Jung understood this as the integration of previously unconscious contents into consciousness, vastly expanding the range of one's capacities and awareness. The boon is not merely knowledge, but a fundamental transformation of being that makes one capable of functioning at a higher order. It is the fruit of individuation, authentic personality expressing true nature. Hermetically, this is the gold produced by the alchemical process, the medicine that heals all ailments, the key to immortality. Practically, this manifests as wisdom, not mere information but integrated understanding that transforms how one engages with existence. The adept who has achieved this stage possesses something of immense value, but the journey is not yet complete. The boon must be brought back to the world that was left behind. Stage 12. The return and integration. The final stages address the essential question: what does the transformed individual do with their transformation? The hero must return to ordinary life, bearing the gift won through ordeal. This return is often more difficult than the outward journey because it requires translating transcendent experiences into communicable form and living them in the midst of ordinary existence. The refusal of the return shows the temptation to remain in elevated states rather than engaging with the mess of human life. The magic flight represents the sometimes frantic attempt to escape the forces that would drag one back into unconsciousness. Rescue from without acknowledges that even the enlightened need help. That transformation is ultimately a collective rather than purely individual achievement. Crossing the return threshold demands that one find ways to embody transcendent realization in immanent form. The master of two worlds is the individual who can move fluidly between ordinary and non-ordinary consciousness, who can be fully human while also accessing transpersonal dimensions. Freedom to live is the final achievement, existence no longer compelled by unconscious complexes, fears or desires, but freely chosen and authentically expressed. Jung saw the completion of individuation not as a state of permanent bliss, but as the capacity for ongoing conscious engagement with the self, continuing the dialogue between ego and unconscious throughout life. The Hermetic tradition recognizes that the completion of the great work is simultaneously an ending and a beginning, that the adept who has achieved this stage now has the responsibility to assist others on their journeys. At the nadir of the journey, in the darkest hours of the belly of the whale and the most shattering trials, the hero confronts the existential abyss. This is not a metaphorical darkness, but the actual encounter with meaninglessness, with the terror of non-being, with the authentic possibility that the entire endeavor is futile and that nothing lies beyond the dissolution of the ego except void. Every genuine transformative tradition acknowledges this crisis because it is unavoidable. The mystics called it the dark night of the soul, the moment when all previous sources of meaning collapse, and one hangs suspended over an abyss of despair. The alchemists encoded it in their emblems of putrefaction and death, the skeleton in the retort, the black sun, the raven that announces decay. Jung identified it as the encounter with the death wish, the pull toward dissolution that opposes the life drive, the moment when one confronts the shadow's most terrifying aspect, the wish not to be. This crisis is not pathology, though it may resemble clinical depression to the untrained eye. The crucial difference is teleological. Pathological depression spirals downward without purpose, driven by biochemical imbalances or traumatic patterns that create suffering without meaning. The existential crisis of transformation, by contrast, has a purpose. It is the necessary destruction of inadequate structures of meaning to make space for more comprehensive understanding. The ego, confronted with its own insufficiency and the vast forces of the unconscious, experiences this as annihilation. Everything that once provided stability, beliefs, relationships, achievements, identity itself, reveals its contingency and fragility. One discovers that the person one thought one was is a construction, a fiction, maintained by elaborate defenses against the truth of one's actual nature. This revelation is devastating because it means that decades of effort to build and maintain a coherent self have been, in a sense, wasted on a false project. The hero in this stage often experiences physical symptoms, insomnia, loss of appetite, psychosomatic illnesses that express the soul's distress. Dreams become nightmarish, filled with imagery of death, decay, and dissolution. Waking life feels unreal, as if one is watching oneself from a distance, dissociated from the flow of existence. Relationships rupture because one can no longer maintain the pretenses they require. Work becomes meaningless because the ego's need for validation and achievement has been exposed as hollow. Yet this suffering is not purposeless. The Hermetic tradition insists that the nigredo is the essential foundation of transformation. Nothing new can emerge until the old has been completely broken down. The alchemical maxim solve et coagula, dissolve and coagulate, recognizes that creation requires prior destruction. The psyche, seeking wholeness, must first shatter the partial structures that prevent it from accessing its full nature. Jung observed that patients who avoid this crisis, who through medication or distraction silence the call of the self, condemn themselves to lifelong neurosis. The suffering they avoid in the short term becomes chronic, diffuse, a background static of dissatisfaction and inauthenticity that colors their entire existence. By contrast, those who consent to enter the darkness, who allow the ego to die without knowing whether anything will survive, create the possibility for genuine rebirth. The philosophical question here is profound. What justifies this suffering? If the journey offers no guarantee of success, if one might dissolve into the darkness and never emerge, why undertake it? The Hermetic answer is that consciousness itself demands it. Once awakened to the insufficiency of unconscious existence, once the call has been heard, there is no true peace in refusal. The choice becomes not whether to suffer, but whether to suffer meaninglessly, or to suffer in service of transformation. The dark night teaches lessons that cannot be learned any other way. It strips away every false support, every strategy for avoiding truth, every comfortable lie. It reveals the actual ground of existence beneath all the constructions of culture and personality. In this darkness, one discovers what remains when everything else is gone. For some, this is absolute terror, the void that Buddhism names as the truth of all phenomena. For others, it becomes the womb of rebirth, the darkness from which new light can emerge. The difference between pathological breakdown and transformative crisis lies in what happens next. Does the individual remain trapped in the darkness, unable to move forward or back? Or does the dissolution eventually give way to the first stirrings of a new synthesis? The Hermetic tradition provides crucial guidance here. One must maintain faith in the process, even when there is no evidence that the process will succeed. This is not blind faith, but what the alchemists called philosophical faith. The recognition that transformation follows natural laws, that spring follows winter, that death necessarily precedes rebirth. The contemporary world makes this crisis more difficult because it pathologizes all suffering, seeks to medicate or therapy away all discomfort, and lacks frameworks for understanding transformative pain. The seeker undergoing this crisis may be diagnosed, prescribed antidepressants, and urged to return to normal functioning, precisely the state of unconscious complacency that the self is attempting to destroy. This is where authentic esoteric community becomes essential, where those who have traversed this darkness can offer witness that emergence is possible. The individual who emerges from the complete cycle of the hero's journey is fundamentally different from the person who began it. This is not a matter of acquiring new knowledge or skills, though these may accompany transformation. It is a change in the very structure of consciousness, in the locus of identity, in one's relationship to existence itself. Jung called this the realization of the self, the achievement of individuation. The ego, having died and been reborn, no longer claims to be the entirety of the personality. It recognizes its proper function as the executive center of consciousness, in service to the deeper intelligence of the totality. This produces a characteristic quality, paradoxical humility combined with unshakable authority. The individuated person knows their limitations, yet acts with complete conviction, because action proceeds from alignment with one's deepest nature, rather than from ego compensation. The philosopher's stone, the goal of the alchemical opus, was said to possess 3 miraculous properties. It could transmute base metals into gold, cure all diseases, and prolong life indefinitely. Understood symbolically, these represent the actual capacities of the transformed consciousness. The ability to transmute represents the capacity to find meaning and value in all experience, to transform suffering into wisdom and obstacles into opportunities. The healing power represents psychological wholeness, the integration of split-off aspects that no longer drain energy through neurotic conflict. The extension of life points not to physical immortality, but to liberation from compulsive patterns, the freedom to live each moment fully rather than being imprisoned by past conditioning or future anxiety. In practical terms, the integrated individual demonstrates specific qualities. They possess genuine autonomy, no longer controlled by unconscious complexes or driven by compulsive needs for validation, security, or control. They exhibit what the Stoics called equanimity, the ability to maintain interior stability regardless of external circumstances. They access creativity effortlessly because they are no longer blocked by the internal conflicts that inhibit spontaneous expression. Most significantly, they relate to others from presence rather than projection, seeing people as they are rather than as screens for one's own unconscious contents. This transformation carries profound ethical implications. The individuated person cannot help but act morally because morality is no longer an external imposition, but the natural expression of integrated wholeness. When one experiences oneself as continuous with all existence, rather than as a separate, threatened entity, harming others becomes self-harm. The Golden Rule operates not as commandment, but as obvious recognition of actual relationship. Yet the Hermetic tradition is clear that this transformation is never complete in any final sense. The self continues to unfold, consciousness continues to deepen, and new dimensions of reality continue to reveal themselves. The difference is that the individuated person possesses the tools and awareness to engage with ongoing transformation consciously, rather than being helplessly swept along by unconscious forces. The responsibility this places on the transformed individual is immense. Having received aid on the journey, having been rescued from the darkness, having been granted the ultimate boon, one now owes a debt to existence that can only be repaid by assisting others on their journeys. This is why every authentic esoteric tradition includes a teaching function, why the masters return to guide students, why the mystery schools exist. The knowledge gained through individuation is not for personal aggrandizement, but for service to the collective evolution of consciousness. In the modern world, fragmented and materialistic, oriented toward external achievement and disconnected from authentic interiority, the individuated person serves a critical function. They become living proof that transformation is possible, that meaning can be found, that consciousness can awaken to itself. Their existence challenges the assumptions of nihilistic modernity simply by demonstrating an alternative possibility. This is the reason why institutions like the Hermetic school are essential rather than optional. The contemporary seeker attempting to navigate the hero's journey without genuine guidance faces extraordinary difficulties. The culture provides no maps for this territory, dismisses or pathologizes transformative experiences, and offers countless false paths that promise awakening while delivering only ego inflation. A rigorous tradition rooted in the accumulated wisdom of those who have completed the journey offers both map and community. It provides the frameworks that make sense of disorienting experiences, the practices that facilitate transformation, and the community of fellow travelers who can offer support when the darkness threatens to overwhelm. The discipline required is immense. Transformation cannot be achieved through weekend workshops or by consuming spiritual content passively. It demands everything: one's time, energy, certainty, and ultimately one's very self. The Hermetic path is not for dilettantes seeking interesting experiences, but for those willing to stake their existence on the pursuit of truth, regardless of cost. The reward, however, justifies any price. To live as one's authentic self, rather than as a compulsive pattern, to experience the world directly, rather than through the distorting lens of projection, to contribute meaningfully to existence, rather than merely consuming resources, these constitute the only genuine satisfaction available to human consciousness. Everything else, all the compensations and distractions that occupy the unexamined life, eventually reveals itself as hollow. The treasure you seek was never in the distant cave, the sacred text or the teacher's wisdom. It lies in the fire of consciousness itself, in the forge of your own awareness that transforms the dross of unconscious existence into the gold of authentic being. The hero's journey does not end at a destination, but discovers that the one who quests and the treasure sought are and always were the same reality recognizing itself through the play of separation and return.